We've got some breaking news this morning. The Supreme Court has struck down race-based admissions policies in colleges as unconstitutional. The court ruled against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina in two cases brought by the group Students for Fair Admissions, which have argued that the school's affirmative action policies discriminate against white and Asian American applicants. The rulings broke down along partisan lines, with Justices Thomas, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Coney Barrett voting to strike down affirmative action, and it's a 6-3 decision. The liberal justices Kagan, Sotomayor, and Ketanji Brown Jackson dissenting. Brown Jackson, who is a double Harvard graduate and former member of the university's Board of Overseers, actually recused herself from that case.
Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in his opinion that universities have long, quote, concluded wrongly that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Our constitutional history does not tolerate that choice. In dissent, Justice Sotomayor said the decision rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress. Look, I think that characterization from Justice Roberts is inaccurate. The decision wasn't that challenges bested or what have you aren't what is important. The decision has been that race, in some levels, in some ways, is a proxy for those kinds of challenges, given that we live in a world which up until recently people understood had a lot of systemic racism. I know you're not allowed to say systemic racism anymore, and some conservatives are trying to ban that language from being discussed out in school, but the underlying realities that drove the decision to start to implement affirmative action programs included a lot of research about those exact systemic biases that exist up until today, where if your name on an application is read as a Black name, even if you have the identical resume, you're less likely to be hired for a position. All of the studies that we know about housing discrimination, where the same discrimination continues up to date to happen to people who make lease applications that are identical to other people's lease applications that present as white. And so the understanding was that it was perhaps appropriate to use race as a proxy, knowing that there is all of this discrimination that exists in the world. And the decision today says that there is no longer that discrimination, and therefore the use of race as a proxy is not fair. Now, I think that you're able to not have to use race as a proxy for discrimination. I think that you can use other kinds of things, including class, to try to get at the same kinds of objectives, and maybe that's where people will pivot to next.
The system, the kind of discrimination you're just describing is what existed in many admissions process, including Harvard, for the category of Asians. And that is why ultimately this case was, I think no one expected this ruling to go the other way. Obviously, the conservatives have a majority in the Supreme Court as well. But Harvard had to defend a policy that looked frankly racist, I think even to people who are otherwise supportive of affirmative action, where the admissions officials are essentially trying to artificially limit the number of Asians because they're too, expressing things like they're too Asian. And in fact, also showing that this is not just about having fewer Black people in colleges, but frankly showing a preference as well for white applicants 100%. From what is described as sparse country. Harvard had a just incredibly racialized, collectivized view of human individual worth that is utterly immoral and evil, and I think this is a momentous day for treating people as individuals.
Part of what you just said, people from sparse countries, that's obviously not racial, right? In fact, it's because of the distribution of Americans and how white, frankly, rural America is, that policy advantages white people. So if you are an applicant to Harvard from, say, Utah, you are much more likely.
From a county where there's not been previous people going to Harvard, they gave you a discount on your scores.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you say that this is disrupting a racialized view of the world, well, the goal was, and probably will continue to be, to have a college class that is representative of the United States of America. Now, to that end, there has been an incredible amount of affirmative action, as you point out, for white people in colleges where they have gotten rid of these kinds of racially selective programs. What you see is the number of Black people in the schools aren't as dramatically affected because, frankly, already there aren't that many Black people in these schools. but that the numbers of Asian Americans skyrockets, the number of white Americans, and the white Americans go down. So what's really interesting here is this is an enormous blow to white students who have been boosted on the basis of America being a 75% white country.
I don't think anyone should care about that. I don't care if I don't care if Harvard's undergraduate class is 100% Korean American. It just doesn't matter
I'm saying value neutral statements. I'm just describing what the likely effect of this is going to be. What we've seen in the UC schools is that's exactly what's happened. And I think that when people are looking at whether or not there are these programs that to some people's mind, unfairly advantage X, Y, and Z, and that it's not purely merit-based. Well, if we're going to move to a purely merit-based system, I think that there has to be a lot of scrutiny about athletic scholarships. There has to be a lot of scrutiny about legacy. I believe it was, let me Google the exact number, but an enormous amount of the Harvard class is legacy, and that also contributes to boosting the numbers of white students, because up until recently, there were very many Black, Asian, Latino, or otherwise people that were allowed to be admitted at Harvard to begin with.
I think those policies should be gotten rid of as well. But the reason they haven't been struck down is because the court system because racism in these practices is explicitly illegal under the law.
So 25 to 35% of students admitted to Ivy League schools come from a family with legacy status. That's 25 to 35%. Obviously, the number of Black kids at these schools, it hovers around 8, 9, 10% around the population of Black people in America, usually a little bit under. And that number drops dramatically when you get out of the top tier of schools. So there's like a middle upper tier where, because there just aren't as many Black kids to go around, they really struggle to get qualified admittance.
Right. I mean, I think we should
admittance to their schools.
We should just accept that the absolute most elite upper tier is going to be, they have to admit based on just academic rigor, and if that makes them wildly disproportionately Asian, that's just the way it's going to be.
This is interesting though, because Harvard has never admitted Harvard can admit an entire class of people with 1,600 SAT scores if they want to.
Yeah.
And race aside, they declined to do so. One, because there's an acknowledgement that once you get 1,500, maybe even mid 1,400s are already in the 99 percentile, right? And the difference between a 1,400 score and a 1,600 score is 5 questions on the math and verbal. I mean, it is, at this point, it's statistically insignificant. So I think wisely, very elite schools say things like, well, what else do we care about in a student? Is it just raw test-taking scores? Is that predictive of success in the same way that other kinds of extracurricular commitments are an issue? I remember when I was applying to college, there was some conversation about whether or not having personal tragedy, a recently deceased parent, was something that you should talk about in your essay to give some context to the fact that you managed to have such good grades while enduring personal tragedy. There's a lot of things going on in people's lives. People have to work jobs, they're indigent, they have parents that are going through divorces, they have a lot of stuff going on. And I personally don't think that it should be strictly based on testing.
Maybe they should just do it at random. What they can't do is what they've been doing, is saying, well, we have too many people named Chang. Who else is on this list? That is over.
I think that's absolutely true. And as someone who has, friends that are Asian American who are also working class, who came from families that did not have all of those kinds of advantages, but who felt at times that wasn't really seen because they happen to be also Asian American. I think that's a really important issue. And I would love to see schools really follow the logical path here, which is to really consider class more in their admissions standards in a way that I think is going to, frankly, disadvantage a lot of the people who've been advocating for these changes to affirmative action. But I think this is right. If the issue is that the race as a proxy is inadequate and is hurting Asian Americans, then there are other ways to just stop using proxies and get to the core of the issue. There are people who are disadvantaged demonstrably, not just because of race, but because of the confluence between race and class and other factors that we know exist in America. And it'll be great if colleges start focusing more on that.
The most qualified applicants, and there are other schools that are really good for the next most qualified applicants, and then there are schools a little down from that are also fine, maybe even cheaper, that are good for the next most qualified applicants, and that should be
Robby,
the process.
When you say that, you're assuming that we all have the same understanding of what a qualified student should be. what makes someone qualified, especially once you're already at a very high tier in terms of test taking. There are too many kids. When you're talking about a school like Harvard, there are too many kids who are already in the 99 percentile. So the question is, what do you look at next? And I think that people absolutely should look at class, how you grew up, what advantages you had. Could your parents pay thousands of dollars for private SAT tutoring the way that so many people I know actually had? And is your ability for your parent to pay for you to have violin lessons and travel to Italy and learn a language and get private tutoring what should determine getting into a school like Harvard and having more advantages over the rest of the population for the rest of your life? I think a lot of people think there's a lot more that goes into a valuable, smart, accomplished 18-year-old kid than just the kinds of things that money can predict.
No, I agree with that. I think they cared too much about the violin lessons and the swim team and all that stuff.
But the test taking is also part of that.
The test take, I mean, we're not all starting out on a perfectly equal footing,
no,
so there will
not,
always be some inequality in this, but the tests are much more...
I immediately tested in like 95th percentile, and I had private tutoring, and I got 100 points higher on my score and got into the 99th percentile.
The tests are more equitable than any other way of measuring your likelihood of success in higher education.
I will say this to folks, as someone who's the direct beneficiary of a lot of the economic advantages and the personal advantages, having had a kind of extraordinary childhood and having lived abroad and having traveled and having parents who were teachers and so I could go to the private schools and stuff, I've witnessed the advantages that exist. And I think the system is very rigged. And the idea that you can just be born and smart and try hard and have the same advantages in getting into a school like Harvard as everybody else, I hate to break it to you, but you're being sold a false bill of goods.
In the real world, people will always have certain advantages over others, but the test system is more fair than holistically or considering all the things you were just mentioning, that wealthy people or people for whatever racial reasons can game that system much more.
I'm saying the reason people look at a slate of things. I agree that there's some equity that comes through the testing as a system. It allows people like my Asian American friend who came from a working class background, he's able to get out of that largely because of testing, right? At the same time, you look at a broader basket of things, because if it was purely testing, Harvard there's 1,600 people in the class. There's too many kids in America you can't just pick, you still have to pick within the people who have near perfect or perfect SAT scores, right?
They should just pick at random.
Okay.
Philip, what would be more fair and equitable than that?
Many people appreciate that there are other things that can be our metrics of people's value to a community than like, maybe they did community service. Maybe they are interested in public outreach. Maybe you want a class where not every single person... Wait a minute. Maybe you want a class where not every single person wants to go to business school or law school. Maybe you want people that go into different sectors of society so you can have better representation of your class later. So you have not just presidents, but famous epidemiologists and artists and all of those things that went to Harvard. Those are the kind of things that schools are looking at. So yeah, it can't just be your test score. Sometimes you want to pick someone who's a brilliant chemist. Somebody wanted to pick someone who's a brilliant artist. That's not discriminatory. Those are the decisions that private colleges can make, and they continue to be able to make those decisions.
Well, they have. Right, but in practice, what they have often done is policies you and I don't like, right? They've said, well, okay, whose father gave the most money to our
and
new chemistry wing.
And they're still allowed to do that, and they still will do that.
And I'm saying that's inappropriate. They shouldn't be allowed to do.
Well, there's not going to be. There's not going to be any
constitutional.
There's not going to be any Supreme Court case that strikes that down.
Because that's not illegal. It could be for public institutions. I'd be perfectly happy to make it illegal. I just wanted to point out before we end this too that this is not. I'm sure the mainstream media will spin this as like, again, conservatives who have taken taken control of the Supreme Court, jamming something unpopular on the American people, even though like ending exactly this policy is supported by virtually all Republicans and even 60% of Democrats. It has never been it's lost when it's been put on the ballot. Even in places like California has voted against affirmative action, or specifically race-based admissions in college. It is not. It is a losing issue for the, again, sliver of the population that believes in it. But I can't wait to see the narrative on how this is.
Although there has been a lot of reconsideration and pushback and anger among white college students in the UC system because they're not able to get in as high numbers as they were able to get into when affirmative action was still artificially inflating the numbers of white students there.
Okay. More Rising right after this.